Welcome to Rich on the Road Across America.
Hey there, I'm Rich, and welcome back to Lucille's Wintertime Tune-Up. We're working through the 10 items this year. We have replaced the coolant, the clutch plates, the exhaust crush rings, the front and rear brake pads, and today we're going to be bleeding the master cylinder for the front and rear brakes. I'm going to be using Honda's DOT4 high performance fluid for the brake system. The only thing I'm going to be using that may not be in your toolbox is 3/16 inch inside diameter vinyl tubing. Other than that, it's just going to be screwdrivers, box wrenches, and pliers. If you're familiar with or you understand closed hydraulic clutch or brake systems, go ahead and fast forward 2 minutes because I'm going to talk about it for a second. I don't know about you, but it always helps me to understand how a system works to perform the maintenance better. A hydraulic brake system or clutch system is a closed system of fluid. When you squeeze a lever, it pushes that fluid in the system towards a piston. That is the brake caliper. The calipers push out, they press on the brake pads squeeze on the rotor, and that slows the turning of the tire. Same is true for a clutch. When you squeeze the clutch, it pushes the fluid through the system. That pushes a middle spindle that pushes the clutch pressure plate away from the clutch plates. That releases the friction. The motor continues turning, but because the friction has been released, which no longer turns the gears, which means that it's not transferring power to the drivetrain, be that a chain, a belt, or in this case, a shaft. When you release those levers, it pulls the fluid back through the system. That means the brake calipers loosen, the brake pads come off of the rotor, and the wheel turns freely. It also means that the clutch pressure plate is now allowed to come back with the springs to apply pressure to the plates, which means the friction plates contract and touch each other, and they transfer the power from the motor to the gearbox to the drivetrain. There's two things which highly affect the performance of a hydraulic system. You want to maintain the integrity of the fluid. One is moisture. Moisture breaks down the viscosity of brake fluid. Also, air in the system will affect the performance. It allows that fluid to be compressed. That creates a sponginess, an inconsistency in the system. That means your brakes and your clutches won't engage and disengage properly. Now, for you real mechanics out there, I know that's a very simplistic overview, but that's my understanding. I'm not a mechanic. I know there's a lot more when you talk about master cylinders, slave cylinders. I'm just talking about a high-level understanding of how the system works. These little pieces of knowledge help me understand these systems, and I hope it helps you out a little bit too. So let's get to work and actually bleed the brakes. First thing is work area preparation. Brake fluid is highly caustic and will destroy paint jobs. I still have the gas tank removed from when we replaced the coolant, but more than likely your gas tank will still be on. You'll want to cover it with some towels to protect the paint. I'm still going to cover up my bike to protect the paint on the frame or the radiator or anywhere else on the front fender. First thing we want to do is remove the top of the reservoir here. Just a Phillips head screwdriver, and we'll take the two screws out. We'll remove the outer cap first. Inside of that is a little plastic inner cap. Trying to be careful not to spill fluid everywhere. It's going to happen, but still trying to be careful. There's the inner cap. Now for the little rubber diaphragm that sits on top of the fluid. And lastly, there is a little styrofoam float. Now you can see the actual fluid, and it's a little bit dark, which means it's been exposed to some moisture and heat, and it needs to be replaced. Throughout this entire process, we've got to keep an eye on this level. We never want this fluid level to dip down to where it starts to suck air into the system. So as we bleed it out, we keep an eye on this constantly to make sure we add a little bit more fluid to keep this level up. Since this is a closed system, as we bleed fluid down below, it's going to push the fluid down through the system and out the bleed cap. As this goes through and bleeds out, the new fluid will go through the system, and that will replace the old fluid with new fluid. We are at the front caliper on the right-hand side of Lucille. I've covered up her fender to keep her nice and safe. We're going to remove this dust cap off of the bleed cap. We're going to use the 3/16 inside diameter tubing that we talked about. Just a little bit of advice, I got 20 feet of this at Lowe's. For the same price, I could get 2 feet at an automotive store. You only need about 2 feet, but for the price, I couldn't pass up the home improvement store. Since I have a metric cruiser, we're going to be using an 8mm wrench to put on the little bleed nut. This will allow me to open and close the bleed valve. Then we'll put the tubing on top of the bleed nozzle. Another little piece of advice just to help you out. As you're working up here, it's easy to turn the wheel back and forth, but be careful that you don't. That brake reservoir is on the handlebar above, and if you turn this, it'll change the angle of the handlebar and will spill brake fluid out. So you always want to make sure that you keep this stationary as possible. We're going to run this tube down into a bottle so that the brake fluid can bleed out. What we're going to do up top is squeeze the brake a few times and then hold. As we hold the brake up top, we'll open the bleed cap to allow fluid to come out, and then shut it off. Make sure that you always shut this all the way off so no air can get back down in the system. Also make sure that you're always holding that brake lever closed as you open this. That pushes the fluid through the system and out. And as you can see, it's dark. We're going to keep doing that over and over and over until we start seeing clear fluid come out. The whole time we're doing this, we're also keeping an eye on the fluid level in the reservoir to make sure no air gets introduced into the system. Pump the brake, squeeze and hold, open. Pump the brake, squeeze and hold, open. Just over and over and over until we start seeing some clear fluid come out of here. I just added more fluid up top. You'll often feel like you're not getting anywhere, but trust me, you are, and you will. Currently the fluid coming out of the tube is pretty much the same color as the fluid in my reservoir, so that makes me feel like I've got it flushed pretty well. You can see what came out was much darker than what is coming out. So I flushed out a lot of the old fluid. We're gonna take this tube off, let it drain down into my bottle, make sure that this is closed off good, put the dust cap back on, do a little cleanup here, and then we'll move to the other side of the wheel. We're now on the left side of the motorcycle. We're at the brake assembly. I've connected the hose to the bleed valve and I have the release wrench on there. I don't know why, but on the right-hand side of the bike, the release valve requires an 8mm wrench, but on the left-hand side of the bike, it's a 10mm wrench. We've taken the top dust cover off, hooked it all up. We're ready to start the same process. Pump the brake, hold, release, close. This is a pretty time-consuming, boring job, but it's really vital to the safety of the rider and to the system. Admittedly, this side is much harder because you're working on the lower left-hand side of the bike, but the brakes are on the upper right-hand side of the bike. Always keep an eye on the brake reservoir to make sure it never gets down to where it's pumping air into the system. Really dark fluid coming out of here, but that's good. That's what we want to get rid of. You can already see it's getting clearer than when we started. Okay, feeling pretty good about that. You can see the color of the fluid that's coming out and the darkness of the fluid that originally came out. So I've topped off the reservoir. We're gonna put the floats and the diaphragms and the caps back on. In my view window, I want to make sure that I'm about 2/3 of the way full. Since I have new brake pads, it can go a little bit fuller, but 2/3 is the recommended height. First, we'll put in the styrofoam float. Then we'll put in the rubber diaphragm, which is also a gasket. Next, we'll put in the inner plastic cap. Then we'll place the outer cap. And finally the 2 screws. Do a little final cleanup. So I think that finishes off our front brake calipers. Then we'll move to the rear brake calipers. On the Honda VTX, the front and the rear brakes have what's called a linked braking system, meaning that the rear brakes and the front brakes are somewhat connected. When you apply one, it slightly applies the other. We remove this dust cover and use this bleed valve to bleed the front. This lower bleed valve and dust cover links to the rear. We'll start bleeding the rear here first, and then we'll move to the rear to finish off bleeding. I've connected the bleed tube, run it down into my catch basin. Then we have to go over to the rear brake fluid reservoir and open it up. On the right hand side of the engine is the brake reservoir. We take a 5mm Allen head, undo the bolt that holds the cover. This cover is just a dressing. Then we'll take the top off the reservoir, and I can see by looking at this, it is really low and dirty. It definitely needs to be replaced. So let's top it off. And we'll work our way back around to the left-hand side of the bike to the brake caliper so we can begin bleeding. This is an 8mm bleed valve. Connect up the hose. We will open and close as we pump the rear brake pedal. So I'm pumping, just same as on the front. I'm pumping, holding, opening. Pumping, holding, opening. You see how dark that fluid is? And we just do this over and over until we start seeing some clear fluid. We're at the rear of the bike. We're going to remove the rear dust cover. Hook up a 10mm wrench. Connect my hose. Make sure my hose is down into my drain cup. Then I'm going to pump the brake, rear brake, hold, open, then close, pump, open, and close. I've topped off the reservoir with the brake fluid. We'll put the cap back on it. Now take this bolt loose and replace the decorative cover on it. When it comes to brake fluid, it's not the same as oil or gas. It's not about the volume that you put back in. It's flushing out the old and making sure the new is starting to come out. That way you know the system from end to end has nothing but new fluid in it. Well, that completes bleeding the brake fluid. It's step number 5 on the list. Next time, we'll be bleeding the clutch master cylinder. Thanks for watching, and I hope you're enjoying this series of videos of Lucille's wintertime tune-up. See you guys.
I may be poor, but I'm rich on the road across America.